The helicopter came in low and loud the way they all did, kicking dust into the teeth of everyone on FOB Salerno, who had the bad luck of standing near the landing pad at 900 on a Tuesday in November. Most helicopters brought things the base needed: ammunition, medical supplies, replacement parts for the 3 vehicles that had been sitting cannibalized behind the motor pool since August, their insides harvested the way you harvest a garden when winter is already coming and you've stopped pretending otherwise. This helicopter brought the visitor. Private First Class Amara Diallo was the one who saw him first, which she would later describe as the worst kind of luck, the kind that attaches itself to you and follows you around for the rest of the day like a smell. She was running a parts manifest near the landing pad when the door opened, and he stepped out civilian clothes under a military-issue jacket that fit him the way borrowed clothes always fit, which is to say not at all, clipboard in his left hand, rolling carry-on in his right, which was on a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan in November 2009, so cosmically wrong that Amara genuinely looked around to confirm she was where she thought she was. She was. He was. The carry-on had a luggage tag. Amara went back to her manifest and did not look up again, which was the correct instinct, and she would trust it for the rest of the day. His name, it would later emerge, was Gerald Purcell, GS-14, Department of Defense, Office of Personnel and Readiness. He had flown commercial to Bagram, then caught a military transport to Salerno, and he had brought with him a clipboard, a rolling carry-on, and a mandate from someone in an office building in Arlington, Virginia, to conduct a performance and compliance review of one Captain Nadia Osman, whose deployment orders, according to the filing system that Gerald Purcell's office maintained, did not exist. Nobody on base called him Gerald Purcell. Nobody on base called him anything with a name in it. From the moment he stepped off that helicopter and asked the nearest soldier where he could find the commanding officer's office, he was the visitor, not the inspector, not the suit, not any of the dozen other things soldiers call people who arrive from desks with clipboards. The visitor, said the way you say weather event, said the way you say we've seen this before and we're already tired of it. Captain Nadia Osman was at her desk when Sergeant Major Caldwell knocked and told her. She was running 3 things simultaneously, which was her baseline: a supply reroute through coast that had been delayed 4 days because of a bridge assessment that nobody had bothered to complete, a personnel request for 2 additional interpreters that had been bouncing between desks at Bagram for 11 days, and a map she'd been marking in red pen since 600 because something about the pattern of small arms incidents in the Bermel district over the past 3 weeks was bothering her the way a sound bothers you when you can't name it. Caldwell said, "Ma'am, there's a visitor." She capped the red pen. "Went. He's already here." She stood, straightened her uniform with 2 precise movements, and walked to the makeshift conference room that the base commander, Colonel Farris, had set aside for the review. She walked the way she always walked on this base, which was the way a person walks when they have decided that the ground belongs to them, and they are simply allowing others to use it. The visitor was already seated when she arrived. He had his clipboard out. She sat across from him, folded her hands on the table and waited. He introduced himself. She noted his title. He explained the purpose of his visit in the careful, circular language of someone who has rehearsed it enough times that it has stopped meaning anything. And she listened to all of it the way you listen to turbulence on a plane, aware of it, unfrightened, waiting for it to pass. Then he opened his folder and looked down at it and said, without looking up, "Captain Osman, according to our records, your deployment orders to FOB Salerno were never properly filed with the Office of Personnel and Readiness." Nadia said nothing. "Which means," he continued, still not looking up, "that your presence here is technically unverified." The word unverified sat on the table between them, like something he'd set down, deliberately. She looked at it, she left it there. "I understand," she said. He looked up then, because that was not the response he'd prepared for. The formal review was scheduled for 1400. By 1300, word had moved through the base the way word always moves through a base, which is faster than radio and less accurate than nothing. Private Diallo heard it from a mechanic named Tors, who heard it from one of the radio operators who had been in the hallway outside the conference room that morning. The story arrived in pieces, the way all true things arrive, a fragment here, a detail there, nothing in the right order. What was consistent across all versions? The visitor had a folder. The folder said Nadia's orders didn't exist. The visitor was going to say so again at 1400, this time with witnesses. At 1358, the room held. The visitor, Colonel Faris, Major Hensley from the JAG office, two junior officers whose names Amara would not remember afterward, and Nadia herself, seated at the near end of the table in the same chair she'd used that morning, hands folded in the same position, face carrying the same expression, which was the expression of someone waiting for a bus they know will eventually come. The visitor read from the folder. He was good at it, Amara would later admit, in the grudging way you admit competence in someone you have already decided to dislike. He had the bureaucrat's gift for making the procedural sound consequential, for loading words like discrepancy and unsubstantiated with the weight of something almost moral. He read out the gaps in Nadia's file, a missing countersignature from a colonel who had since rotated out, a commendation citation that referenced an operation whose classification level made it invisible to his clearance, a deployment amendment that had apparently been filed and then, somewhere between Bagram and Arlington, ceased to exist. He did not say she had done anything wrong. He didn't need to. The architecture of what he was building didn't require accusation. It only required doubt. Enough procedural fog, enough missing paperwork, enough technically and according to our records, and a person's entire record of service could be made to look like a question mark. Major Hensley shifted in his seat twice during the reading. Colonel Faris looked at his hands. The two junior officers looked at the wall. Nadia looked at Gerald Purcell. Not through him, not past him. At him, the way a surveyor looks at land they are about to measure. When he finished, he set the folder down and said, "Captain Osman, do you have documentation that addresses any of these discrepancies?" "Some of it is classified above your clearance level," she said. "The rest is being located." "Being located," he repeated, with the particular intonation of a man who has learned to make repetition sound like skepticism. "Yes." "By whom?" "By the people who know where it is." Colonel Faris made a sound that was not quite a cough, and not quite a laugh, and was, in any case, quickly suppressed. The visitor wrote something on his clipboard. Nadia watched him write it. She did not ask what it was. By 1600, they were outside the building. Not in a group exactly. Not organized in any way that could be called a demonstration or a gathering or anything that had a name. Just present. Mechanics from the motor pool, still in their coveralls. Two of the medics from the aid station, still in their scrubs. Radio operators on a smoke break that had been going on for 40 minutes. The three interpreters who worked with Nadia's unit, standing slightly apart the way they always stood, which was close enough to be there and far enough to have deniability. Amara stood near the door with her parts manifest still in her hand, having forgotten at some point that she was supposed to be elsewhere. The visitor came out at 16:15 to walk to the mess hall and stopped when he saw them. He looked at the group the way you look at a weather system you didn't check the forecast for, the quick reassessment, the recalibration of how the next hour was going to go. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. He walked to the mess hall. Behind him, Sergeant Major Caldwell stepped out of the building, surveyed the assembled soldiers, mechanics, medics, and interpreters, and said, to no one in particular. You're all very busy people. Nobody moved. Caldwell put a toothpick in his mouth. Dismissed, he said, without any particular conviction. They dispersed slowly, the way crowds disperse when they have made their point and are satisfied with it. Inside, Nadia was at a different desk now, working the map again. The red marks had multiplied since morning. Amara, walking past the window, could see her through the glass, the pen moving, the head down, the posture of a person who has decided that the work will not wait for the situation to resolve itself. Because the work never waits, because the situation is always something, and the work is the only constant. Amara stood at the window for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went back to her manifest. Phase 4, the folder she didn't. Warrant Officer First Class James Decker had been on FOB Salerno for 22 months, which was 7 months longer than his original rotation, and a fact he mentioned to no one because he had stopped counting. He was 44 years old. He had a bad knee, a good memory, and a habit of keeping records that nobody asked him to keep, not because he distrusted the system, but because he had been working within the system long enough to know exactly how the system lost things. At 1700, he walked into the review room without knocking. The visitor was alone, reviewing his notes. Decker set a folder on the desk. It was thicker than the visitor's folder, considerably thicker, the kind of thick that takes on physical authority that makes the other folders in the room quietly reconsider their choices. "What is this?" the visitor asked. "Captain Osmond's operational record," Decker said. "The parts that don't require your clearance level." He stood there while the visitor opened it. The first page. A supply chain Nadia had rebuilt in March 2009, after the primary route through the Coast Valley was compromised by an IED that destroyed 2 vehicles and forced a complete logistical reroute. The reroute, which she designed from scratch in 72 hours, had kept the base supplied for the subsequent 4 months without a single critical shortage. The cost saving against the projected emergency procurement budget was noted in a number that had more digits than most people expected. The second page, an intelligence assessment she had filed on October 14, 2008. 40 minutes before an ambush at a checkpoint near Bermel, she had flagged the pattern of movements in the area as consistent with pre-attack reconnaissance. The assessment had been passed up, noted, and filed. The ambush happened anyway. What the record also showed, the 2 soldiers at that checkpoint had been warned by Nadia directly 40 minutes before and had repositioned. They were the only 2 at the checkpoint who walked away. The third page, 3 medevac coordination logs from a single 26-hour period in June 2009, during which a communications blackout had taken down the standard coordination channels. She had run all 3 simultaneously using backup frequencies, civilian channels, and 1 call routed through a translator's personal phone. All 3 medevacs completed. All 3 patients reached surgical care within the required window. Decker stood with his hands behind his back and watched the visitor read. The visitor's pen, which had been moving more or less constantly since his arrival, had stopped. "Where did this come from?" the visitor asked. "I made it," Decker said. "Kept my own copies, force of habit." "This should have been in the central file." "Yes," Decker said, "it should have." He said nothing else. He did not explain the gap between should have been and was not. He did not draw the line that connected those 2 facts to the man sitting at the desk. He simply left the folder there and walked out, which was, in its way, the most devastating thing he could have done. The visitor sat alone with the folder for a long time after that. At 8:30 the next morning, they started coming in. Nobody scheduled it. Nobody sent a memo. It moved the same way the warning about the visitor had moved, through the base's invisible network of people who had been somewhere at the same time as someone who knew something. Except this time, what moved through the network was not information but intention. The first was Tors, the mechanic. He sat down across from the visitor who had not expected company and said, "March 15th, 2009. I was trying to move 4 vehicles worth of parts through the coast route when it went down. Captain Osman had a reroute operational in 51 hours. I know because I was counting. We didn't lose a single vehicle to parts shortage that entire rotation." He stood up and left. The visitor looked at his clipboard, then at the door, then at his clipboard. Specialist Yolanda Park came in next. She was one of the medics. "June 14th through 15th, 2009, she said. Comms blackout. I had a patient GSW to the abdomen, hemorrhaging, needed surgical intervention in under 2 hours. Captain Osman coordinated the medevac through a civilian frequency I didn't even know existed. Patient made it. His name is Corporal David Reyes, and he is currently stationed at Fort Bragg." She left. Then Hassan Karami, one of the interpreters who spoke with a precision that made the visitor, who had been writing, slow down to keep up. Hassan named dates, names, grid coordinates. He described a negotiation Nadia had facilitated in a village 20 kilometers east, without authorization, without backup, using her own working knowledge of the local political structure. A negotiation that had produced 3 weeks of quiet in an area that had produced nothing but noise for 6 months before. "She asked me afterward if I thought she'd done it right," Hassan said. "I told her yes. She said she wasn't sure. I told her the quiet speaks for itself." He left. They kept coming. Radio operators, another mechanic, the base's Afghan National Army liaison who had asked Caldwell for permission to attend and received it without question. A supply sergeant who had worked with Nadia on the coast reroute and wanted the visitor to understand, specifically, what 72 hours meant in practical terms, what she had not slept, what she had not eaten, what she had worked through because the work did not stop for the situation. Each one came in, said one thing, specific and operational and documented, and left. No speeches, no emotion performed for the room, just facts delivered with the flat authority of people who had been there and did not need to embellish what they had witnessed because what they had witnessed did not need embellishment. The visitor stopped writing halfway through. His clipboard sat on the table, and he looked at it the way you look at a tool you have picked up in the wrong room for the wrong job, and our only now understanding cannot help you here. By the time the Afghan Army liaison left, closing the door with the quiet consideration of a man who has been taught that doors are not for slamming, the visitor was alone in a room that felt considerably smaller than it had that morning. Colonel Faris appeared in the doorway. "How are we doing?" he asked in the tone of a man who already knows. "Phase 6, the question she answers." They brought Nadia back in at 1100. The room was different now. The visitor was different, still present, still holding the clipboard, but holding it the way you hold something when you've forgotten why you're still holding it. The folder Decker had brought was open on the table. His own folder was closed. Faris sat to one side. Hensley from JAG sat to the other. The junior officers from the day before were not present. Nobody had told them not to come. They had simply assessed the room and made a decision, which is its own kind of intelligence. Nadia sat down, folded her hands. The visitor looked at her for a long moment, looked at the open folder, looked at his closed one. Then he asked her, and to his credit, he asked it directly, without the circular procedural language he'd been using since he arrived. "Captain Osman, the orders, the missing documentation, did you know?" The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms get quiet when the question that has been circling for 2 days has finally landed. Nadia looked at him. Not through him, not past him, at him with the full attention of someone who has decided that this moment deserves the courtesy of her complete presence. "I knew," she said, "that the work was getting done." The visitor opened his mouth. She had already looked back down at the table, which told him, as clearly as anything she could have said, that as far as she was concerned, the review was over. It was. Hensley wrote something in his notes. Ferris looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who is thinking about lunch and feeling no guilt about it. The visitor closed his folder. The buried orders were traced back in 4 days. What the trace revealed, working backward through a chain of administrative handoffs and filing decisions, and one specific reassignment request that had been approved without the usual review, was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. No late-night meetings, no explicit coordination, no villain in a room somewhere pulling strings with full awareness of the picture they were painting. What it was, instead, was something more ordinary and therefore more depressing. A series of small decisions made by people who each thought they were making a local choice, each choice a little unfair, none of them individually enough to matter, until you stacked them and stepped back and saw what they had built together. Someone in Bagram had not forwarded the counter-signature request. Someone in the personnel office in Arlington had moved Nadia's file to a secondary queue, the kind that gets reviewed eventually, which in bureaucratic language means the same thing as never. The deployment amendment, the one that would have updated her orders after a mid-rotation reassignment within the FOB, had been filed and then unfiled, which should not have been possible, and the fact that it was possible said something about the filing system that nobody wanted to examine too closely. The visitor's visit had been triggered by a flag in the system. The flag had been entered by someone. That someone's name appeared in the trace. What happened next to that someone was not announced, not publicized, not made into a story. The base learned about it the way the base learned about everything, in pieces, out of order, through Caldwell's toothpick appearing in unexpected places and the particular quality of Ferris's silence in the days after. What was announced? Captain Nadia Osman's orders were verified, backdated to their original filing date, and entered into the central record with all countersignatures complete. What was not announced, but was noted in the JAG office's internal documentation, and would later be cited in a training revision for personnel administration procedures. In the 14 months that Nadia had been operating on FOB Salerno in a state of administrative non-existence, her unit had the highest operational readiness rate on the base. Her supply chains had a 0 critical shortage record. Her intelligence assessments had been accurate in 11 of the 13 instances, where they were specific enough to be verifiable. The 2 she'd missed. One was a weather event that disrupted a planned operation. The other was an ambush she'd flagged, filed, and warned the relevant soldiers about directly, and which had happened anyway, and from which all the warned soldiers had walked away. The numbers did not editorialize. They didn't need to. The visitor left on the 4th day, on a transport back to Bagram. He came out of the administrative building with his rolling carry-on, crossed the open ground toward the landing pad, and passed in sequence. Torres, who was elbow-deep in an engine block and did not look up, Specialist Park, who was walking toward the aid station and looked up briefly and then continued walking, Hassan Karami, who was reading something and did not look up at all. Caldwell was standing near the landing pad. He watched the helicopter lift off with the expression of a man watching a cloud pass, which is to say, nodding it, unsurprised by it, already thinking about something else. When he turned back toward the base, Nadia was at her window. Red pen, map. New marks. Caldwell put a toothpick in his mouth and went back to work. Phase 8, the seal. 2 weeks after the visitor left, FOB Salerno received orders for a significant operation in the Bermel district, the area that had been bothering Nadia since November, the one she'd been marking in red since 600 on the day the visitor arrived. The operational plan that went up the chain incorporated, nearly wholesale, the pattern analysis she had been building for 3 weeks. Her name appeared on the document as contributing analyst. The document went to Bagram. Bagram sent it to Kandahar. Kandahar sent it further. Nobody told her any of this. She found out the way she found out most things on this base. Caldwell appeared in her doorway with a toothpick and an expression that was not quite a smile and said, "Your map's going places." She looked up from the current map, which already had new marks on it, because there was always a current map and it always already had new marks on it. "Good," she said and looked back down. The operation ran in December. It ran exactly as the pattern analysis suggested it should run, which meant that when contact was made, the unit in the field was positioned correctly, resourced correctly, and had contingency routes that held. The after-action report cited the pre-operation intelligence work as a primary contributing factor to the outcome. 0 casualties. All objectives complete. On the last day of December, the base held a low-key end-of-year gathering in the mess hall. Not a party exactly, because the base was not a place where the word party landed with any comfort, but a gathering, coffee and bad food, and people standing in the particular way soldiers stand when they are not quite off duty, but are trying to approximate it. At some point in the evening, the unit that had run the December operation was in the room, and at some point they were near Nadia, and at some point, without any apparent coordination, they began doing it, not formal salutes. Nothing that required a command or a response, just the small nod, the raised cup. The direct look held a beat longer than necessary. One by one. Not everyone in the room. Not a ceremony. Just the people who knew, acknowledging the person who had done the thing that had allowed them to stand in a mess hall at the end of December and drink bad coffee instead of being somewhere they could not walk away from. Nadia received each one with the same nod. Small, direct, no performance in it. Amara was near the door, watching, and she had her notebook with her because she always had her notebook with her, and she had been writing in it all evening in the way she wrote, which was the way of someone who has decided that bearing witness is a form of service. She watched Nadia accept the last nod, turn back to her coffee, and look out the small, thick-glassed window at the dark outside. Amara crossed the room. She stood next to Nadia for a moment without speaking, which was the appropriate thing to do, and she knew it. Then she said, "Ma'am, were you scared when the visitor came, when the orders were missing, when you didn't know how it was going to go?" Nadia looked at the dark outside the window for a moment longer. She didn't look at Amara when she answered. "The work was still there," she said, "so I was still there." Amara wrote it down. She wrote it in the center of the page, the way you write something you intend to keep, with space around it so nothing else crowds it. The work was still there, so I was still there. Outside, the Afghan winter was doing what it always did, which was everything it wanted, indifferent to the people moving through it. Inside, the gathering was winding down, soldiers drifting toward the door in ones and twos, the bad coffee running out. The year ending the way years end on forward operating bases. Not with celebration exactly, but with the quiet, functional dignity of people who have done hard things and expect to do more hard things, and have made their peace with that expectation. Nadia set down her coffee cup, straightened her uniform with 2 precise movements, and walked out. Not toward the exit, back toward her office. Back toward the map. Amara watched her go. Then she closed her notebook and followed the others out into the cold, carrying the 5 words the way you carry something you don't want to lose, carefully, close to the chest, aware that it is the kind of thing that gets more useful the longer you hold it. The work was still there. So she was still there. The dark outside was complete and cold and offered nothing. The map had new marks on it already.